At Calvary, at the cross, and down at the cross. And we're going to sing the first stanza of the first two and the first and last of Down at the Cross. So, Darryl, we got that? Okay, first stanza of At Calvary, first stanza of At the Cross, first and last stanza Down at the Cross. Stand and sing it with us as we worship. First stanza of At the Cross. And down at the cross, the first and last. Join us now as we fellowship.
I hope you're doing well this evening as we come together for our Sunday evening Bible study. And we're going to be in Genesis chapter 29 tonight. And so I'd encourage you to turn there. We're going to take your prayer concerns, and we'll get those into the bulletin for next week. I just want to ask you, were you blessed this morning by the testimonies of the two ladies that shared this morning? I hope, ladies, that from the line that was long after the service and the affirmation of your church family tonight, that both of you, I'm going to tell on you two, okay? And they both, whenever I talked with them, one of their big concerns was getting emotional while sharing and not being able to share, and not, I guess the thought that something would be lost, that God wouldn't be glorified through it. And I told them both. So Jenny, you were a primer for me talking with Sheila, if that helps you any. I told them, I said, look, if we get emotional or whether we're stoic, if we're giving praise to God, what does it matter? It just shows the depth of the emotions of our situation and how God has worked and delivered us or helped us or provided for us or whatever it was. And so I know that for me this morning it was definitely a blessing, and everyone I talked to after the service ladies, they were blown away by what you were able to share this morning. So guys, we're going to have to step it up next year for Baptist Men's Day. That's all I'm saying. And so you guys start working on that now. We got a year to prepare. But nevertheless, we are in Genesis chapter 29 tonight, and we're continuing in this part of our study of Genesis. And we are at the point where Jacob arrives in Paddan Aram, at the city of Haran, where his grandfather had lived at one point, and his great-grandfather and family had lived. And so to keep us on track with the biblical timeline, since last week in chapter 28, no time has passed. Remember, he was at the altar, and he was leaving to go to Paddan Aram. He was at the altar in Bethel. And so I've got some dates for you. Daryl's going to show those for you. At the start of tonight's chapter, this is the age of the people involved. We know Isaac is 137. We believe that Rebekah is about 116. We know Jacob for a fact is 77. Pretty good information that Laban is about 107. And as far as Leah and Rachel go, as I told on Wednesday night, it's believed that they were twins, and that Leah was obviously the older one. But this comes from Jewish tradition, which is the best information we have. We don't, there's nothing in the scriptures that is the best information. But Jewish tradition holds that they were twins and that they were 22 when Jacob arrived in Haran. And so by the end of the chapter, you're going to see 14 years have passed. So you take the number on the left-hand column and you add 14 years. And so for us, that means that Jacob is 91 at the end of this chapter, and his Leah and Rachel are both 36. And so that gives us a little idea. By the end of the chapter, we're at the year 1695 BC, give or take. That's sort of the belief of when that happened. So let's look at verses 1 through 3 and see about Jacob's arrival in Paddan Aram in Haran. And so it says, then Jacob went on his journey. So when it says then, it means after he set up the altar and after he had that prayer with God and promised that he would do everything that God wanted him to do. It says, then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the sons of the east. He looked and saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep were lying there beside it. For from that well they watered the flocks. Now the stone on the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, they would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep and put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well. So after he set up the altar there in Bethel, he travels somewhere around 350 to 400 miles, somewhere around there, up to Paddan Aram, that region that is sort of north and east of the Euphrates River right here, and the Tigris is over this way. But he traveled and made it to Haran, and he did so. And so when he approached or was reaching the area near Haran, whether he realized it or not, he sees this well in the field and he approaches it. And that particular well, this is a picture of it. I got this off of what used to be called Twitter, on X, if you want to call it that, but on Twitter. A Jewish rabbi took this picture. This is, Haran is in southern, I guess, southeastern Turkey. But it's not far from the Syrian border. And with all the chaos that's been in the world with Syria in the last 8 or 10 years, it's a hard place to visit. But anyway, in Haran, this Jewish rabbi took a picture of this, and when I started looking for pictures of the well, which is still there, this was the only one I could find. I wanted to find on Google Maps too to show you where it's at in relation to the city, and I can't find anything other than it tells us that this well is known to be about a mile outside the city of Haran. And so I got on Google Maps and I stretched the ruler out to find a mile, and I was looking for anything that would look like a well or anything like that, and I couldn't find it. Now it's just I'm looking in the wrong place. Evidently Jacob didn't. He found the well and ended up going from there. But interestingly, this well was used up until at least into the 20th century, 1900s, and it's probably still used today, as you can tell. As you can see in the reflection of the water, there's a grate over it, so they may not use it like they did at one time. But until they put in public water piping and irrigation systems, this well was used because the wells inside the city of Haran in the 1900s were brackish. The water was no good for anything other than watering livestock. So people couldn't drink it. And so, but this well, the well that Jacob used, the well that Abraham's servant went when finding a wife for Isaac, that same well was still, good, even probably up till today. And so what we see is that Jacob, sees this well, and he goes to it. And when he gets there, he sees that there are 3 flocks of sheep lying around the well, and that the stone covering over that well was still in place. And so the stone would have to be put there to protect the water from being poisoned by animals falling in or people falling in and the well no longer being usable. So they put this, as it says in Scripture, this large stone over the top of it, a capstone like we would use like people cover their wells with if you have a concrete type of well covering. But they had that over the top to protect the well so that people could use the well long term. And what they would do is once all of the shepherds arrived with all of their flocks, and I guess they knew how many people in the community would bring their their sheep to the well, they would then remove the stone. And it sounds like it took a couple of people to remove the stone from the way the shepherds speak in verses 4 through 13. And so he sees the well, and that's where he goes to. And so when he gets to the well, we read about Jacob getting to meet not only Rachel but also Laban in verses 4 through 13. So let's look at those verses. It says, Jacob said to them, "My brothers, where are you from?" And they said, "We are from Haran." He said to them, "Do you know Laban the son of Nahor?" And they said, "We know him." And he said to them, "Is it well with him?" Pun intended. I'm just joking. I don't think Jacob was funny like that. But how funny is that you see that? And it's like, I see what you're doing there, Jacob. Okay, anyway, I'm sorry. Pastor Nick with his bad dad jokes. Okay. It says, "And they said, 'It is well, and here is Rachel, his daughter, coming with the sheep.' He said, 'Behold, it is still high day. It is not time for the livestock to be gathered. Water the sheep and go pasture them.' But they said, 'We cannot until all the flocks are gathered.' And they rolled the stone from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep." While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. When Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the mouth of the well and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted his voice and wept. Jacob told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. So when Laban heard the news of Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Then he related to Laban all these things. So when Jacob arrives on the scene at the well, and these 3 flocks are just sort of, bedded down around the well, waiting for everyone else to arrive, Jacob asked those local shepherds, he asked them, said, "Where are you from?" And he finds out that they are from exactly where he needed to be. And so he knew he was in the right area at that point. And so he asked them, "Do you know my uncle Laban, basically? Do you know of Laban, the son or grandson of Nahor?" And they did. And they even mentioned that he's doing well. And by the way, here comes his daughter with one of Laban's flock, or his flock, to be watered. And so Jacob tried to get the other shepherds to water their flocks and go pasture them. I read one commentary this week that I guess was under the indication that Jacob was a lot younger than he actually was, because we know for a fact we can backdate from the time that Jacob dies as Israel in Egypt. We can backdate and know that he's 77 at this point. We know that for a fact. And so I read in one commentary that was under the impression that he was still a much younger man, and said, like any college student, he's trying to run off the competition and get them out of the way so he can put the moves on Rachel. which, it's kind of weird when you think about him being 77 and her being 22, and that doesn't work. But that was the idea, was that, some commentators think that he was just trying to get them to leave so he could have a conversation with them. Maybe he didn't want them to know that they were family, which is kind of weird because he ends up telling in front of them anyway. But for some reason, he's just like, go on and water your flocks and head out. And so the shepherds tell him that they can't do that till all of the flocks from the region or the community come, and then they will all take the rock off, they'll water the flocks, and then they'll put it back and everybody leaves. And so that was what they told him. Well, when Rachel arrived, impressively, she brings Laban's flocks, and what was so impressive about it is the fact that Jacob, at 77 years old, removes the stone by himself. And so it's awesome to see that he removed it when, from the context of the scripture, it sounds like it was such a large stone that it took several people to remove it. But not only did he remove the stone, and that was sort of the commentary I read, that was sort of the male bravado of the young man trying to show off in front of the pretty girl. He's going to try and move the big rock and say, look at my muscles, and here, I'll water your animals too. That sort of a mentality. But he does exactly that. He removes the stone by himself, and then not only that, he waters Laban's flocks for Rachel. And then we read in verse 11 that Jacob kissed Rachel. And the thing we have to understand here is that some will look at that and immediately jump to the fact that it was some sort of a romantic kiss. They were destined to be together, and something out of one of those movies that Terry's always talking about, one of them Hallmark movies that we hear in Sunday school all the time from Terry that he's always mentioning. But it's that idea. That's the idea that we have when we read it just with face value. But that's not what was going on here. There wasn't any kind of it wasn't a romantic kiss. Most likely, it was a kiss on at least one, if not both, of the cheeks. And by doing that, it was his way of showing her that they were family. She literally did not know Jacob from Adam because of the fact that she had never met him, and he's also 55 years older than her, and so she probably knew that her aunt Rebecca had moved south, but probably didn't even know she had any kids. Didn't know if she had all girls, didn't know any of that sort of thing. And so he kissed her on both cheeks and explains to her who he is. Now, let me ask you, wouldn't you have explained to her who you were first and then kissed her? That's sort of the mentality there. But we can't mistake that for a romantic kiss. It was this indication of family. And so when he tells her who he is, she goes to tell her dad. Just like the servants that took, or Rebecca went and got Laban, and all those years before when Isaac's, or Abraham's servant was looking for a wife for Isaac. And so Laban runs out to meet his nephew that he, to all indications, has never met, may not even known that he lived. And again, we see this familial kiss, this embrace, and as with Abraham's servant, all those years before, we see that Laban hurriedly takes Jacob home to hear what he has to share. And at that point, I think that's when Laban is able to grill him, so to speak, to find out if he really is Rebekah's son. And so I'm sure that, and the way that probably the way he would have vetted Jacob probably had to do with, well, when your grandfather's servant came, what happened? And Jacob would have probably been able to retell the romantic story of how his mom and dad met. And, well, granddad's servant went and all of this. And so he's probably vetting him and asking questions and finding out stuff and from him to make sure that he is who he says he is. Because then it says at the very last of verse 13, then he related to Laban all these things. He related to him everything that he knew. He shared with him everything he knew that would probably identify who he was, so that Laban would know that he is his nephew. And so we see the vetting process has worked. Not that it wouldn't have, but we see in verses 14 through 20 that Jacob ends up working for Rachel. And so look at verse 14. It says, Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him a month. Then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be? Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful of form and face. Now Jacob loved Rachel. So he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than to give her to another man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of his love for her. And so after Jacob shares everything with Laban about, basically going through that vetting process, Laban gets the words a little backwards in the English for us, but he basically says, you're my flesh and bone, so I know that you are who you are, so stay with me and stay with us while you're here. And so he stayed in Haran for a month at this point and told, Laban, he told him why he was there eventually, because after a month, Laban begins the labor negotiations with Jacob as to what his price would be or his wages would be for him to stay and work. And so he said, Laban tells him, what shall your wages be? And here we have the first descriptions of Laban's daughters, Leah and Rachel. And first we have their names, and it was kind of interesting. One thing I read this week said that they could be an advertisement. Their names could have been advertisements for Laban's livestock business, because he named one Leah, which means cow or wild cow, depending on the definition or the translation. And Rachel means ewe, as in not you, but a small sheep or small lamb. And so they said, it's kind of interesting that Laban, being the deceiver that he always is, he's basically making his children walking billboards for himself. And so we see this. And so after we get these names, and if you look to see what the names mean, that there's descriptions behind that. But then we see that there is a description of Leah's eyes and Rachel's beauty. And there's, these are mentioned. Now, it says that Leah's eyes were weak. And, that could mean a couple of things. One is it could have meant that she was nearsighted or nearly blind. If she were completely blind, then they would have mentioned it. It would have been mentioned in Scripture. So she may have just had poor eyesight. It could have meant that compared to Rachel's eyes that maybe seemed to sparkle or shine to Jacob, her eyes were dull. They didn't sparkle like her sister's eyes did. But lastly, since there's no mention of Rachel's eyes and the fact that they did sparkle or they did seem bright or strong or whatever the term might have been, there's a belief that this was a way of saying that to Jacob, Leah was less attractive than Rachel. That she was less attractive to Jacob than her sister. And so chances are she didn't have vision problems. Chances are it wasn't that her sister's eyes sparkled and hers didn't. It was, from what, Bible commentators and scholars sort of point to, it was probably the fact that because Rachel's beauty is always mentioned, and that was the one that he wanted to marry, that this weak eye comment is probably a reference to the fact that Jacob didn't find her as attractive as he did Rachel. And so Rachel is mentioned as beautiful. She's mentioned to be beautiful in body and in face. And, this caught Jacob's attention. And so Jacob offered to serve 7 years for Rachel. And that was his going price. That was the price of his dowry. That was what he was willing to give Laban. And now in those days, I never learned this until this week. In those days, 3 to 5 years of service was the norm for a person who had no land, no livestock, no gold, money type things to give as a dowry. And so you remember Jacob left. He basically fled from his parents with nothing more than the clothes on his back and the supplies he could carry. And so he doesn't have land, not at least in Haran. He would be heir to the whole land of Canaan at one point. He doesn't have any livestock, not of yet. And he has no real money other than maybe what little he was able to carry with him. And so the thought was that, since he didn't have money, he would offer his services. And so he's paying his dowry by serving for 7 years. But we can tell that if the norm was 3 to 5 years, he's paying what for her? He's paying a premium, right? He sees her as more valuable than a regular woman that he may have married. And so he was willing to serve extra years for Rachel to be his wife. And so Laban thought that it was much better to give his daughter to family rather than one of the local Assyrians. I had to look it up this week because I wasn't sure who was in control of this region of the world at this time. But in the time of about 1700 BC, the Assyrians were already coming to power. They were already starting to have a foothold in this region of the world. So it could have been Hittites or it could have been Assyrians, depending on who was in charge of the region of Haran. It was close to the border of the Assyrian kingdom, if you want to call it that. But he didn't want to give her to one of the locals, whether they were Hittites or Assyrians or whoever. He didn't want to do that. And so when we pick up in the next verse, 7 years have passed. And Jacob is now 84. Rachel and Leah are now somewhere around 22. And that's when we pick up in verses 21 through 30, and we find out about Laban's deception. So look at verses 21 through 30 with me. It says, Then Jacob said to Laban, Give me my wife, for my time is completed, that I may go in to her. Laban gathered all the men of the place and made a feast. Now in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to him, and Jacob went in to her. Laban also gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So it came about in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, What is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served with you? Why then have you deceived me? But Laban said, It is not the practice in our place to marry off the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also for the service which you shall serve with me for another 7 years. Jacob did so and completed her week, and he gave him his daughter Rachel as his wife. Laban also gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her maid. So Jacob went in to Rachel also, and indeed he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban another 7 years. And so after serving this first 7 years, we see that Jacob asked for Rachel's hand in marriage, right? No, what did he say? He asked for what? He didn't ask for Rachel. What did he ask for? His wife. And so he basically, Jacob has been bringing his A game of deception at every turn in the book of Genesis so far. And this is one time where he left his A game at home, so to speak. What we see is that when dealing with a master deceiver who is older and much wiser than you, he should have asked directly for who? Rachel, rather than his wife. And so, this small nuance may have been the opportunity that Laban took. We don't know for a fact that this is it, but he didn't ask for Rachel. He asked for his wife. And so this may have been the opportunity that the deceiver named Laban is looking for, his opportunity to deceive the deceiver Jacob. And so regardless, what we know is that what happens is Laban throws a wedding feast. And he throws this wedding feast. He invites everyone to the feast. And at the end of the night, what he does is he placed what to him seemed like his less desirable daughter in Jacob's tent for the wedding night. And so Jacob woke up the next morning and he wakes up to the shock of a lifetime because he had married the wrong woman. And so in biblical times, the custom was that what they would do is they would have basically a week-long festival. And typically, this sounds like they did it a little differently here, but typically at the end of the week or at some time during the week, the bride and groom would consummate their marriage and they would be considered married, but they would still have the rest of the week as a festival, a big feast and all of that. And so for Jacob, he's technically legally married to Leah at this point. There's no way of backing out saying, hey, you deceived me, you lied to me. According to their customs and their culture, they were married. And so there was no way for Jacob to back out of this. And so the next day he was furious. And he asked Laban on it. And Laban uses the excuse saying, well, we don't marry the younger daughter before the oldest daughter is married. We don't let the younger one go before the oldest one has been married. And so that was his reason for putting Leah in his tent, in Jacob's tent. And so Laban agreed, said, well, if you're not happy with your first wife, I've got Rachel here, and if you'll work another 7 years, we'll give you her as well, if you'll complete this week with Leah, the week of the festival, the week of the wedding ceremony. And so Jacob agrees to it, and at the end of the week, he's given Rachel. And so both wives brought with them servants, Zilpah and Bilhah, that would end up playing big parts, a large part in the next chapter that we'll be reading, actually in a lot of the chapters that we'll be reading going forward. But we end this chapter with Rachel being given to Jacob as a wife. And he served 7 years for her, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. We read that repeatedly in the scriptures, and we see here more of the favoritism that Jacob was accustomed to as a small child or as a young man or even as an adult with his own parents. And so he saw favoritism there, so naturally when it comes to him having two wives, he's naturally going to play the favorite game. But then what do we see when he has children? He plays favorites once again. And just by chance, whose child is the favorite? Rachel's. Joseph is his favorite by, hands down over all the other children. Joseph is the favorite, Rachel's firstborn son. And so, what should stand out to us here is how after all of this is played out, that, these two deceivers, Jacob and Laban, they both thought they got the last laugh a lot of times in their deceptions. Laban probably thought, man, I got Leah married to Jacob. Now I've got Rachel. I've got him in for another 7 years. He's probably thinking, I'll get the last laugh on this. And Jacob's probably thinking, I had to marry Leah, but now I get Rachel, and now I have two wives, but, that's the opportunity for more children. And, he probably thought with Esau and the birthright and the blessing, oh man, I've come out golden on all of this. But the really good thing is that neither one of them really had the last laugh in this situation. Because God did, in fact. Because Laban's less than desirable daughter, as seen by Jacob and by Laban, and maybe even the men in the community, Laban's daughter, who is less than desirable, and Jacob's second place wife, even though she was the first wife, this lady Leah would end up giving birth to the priestly and royal lines in the kingdom of Israel. And so God has the last laugh in it, that even though man sees Leah as, men, I should say, see Leah as just second place, let's just set her back here, she'll be all right type situation. She has a prominent place in the history of Israel, and at this point, nobody sees it. And so this sort of brings us to our life lessons, or the lessons that we learn from Isaac, Jacob, and Esau. And in chapter 29, we learn that God doesn't forget those that are oftentimes forgotten by man. And, chances are that Laban's plan to marry Leah to Jacob before he married Rachel did not start at the beginning of those 7 years. It's probably not that, when he offered to work for Rachel, he's immediately scheming, saying, oh yeah, wait a minute, on the night of the wedding, I'll, do all of this. That wasn't probably the case. Chances are he probably thought that his less desirable daughter, in his eyes, Leah, could be married off sometime in that 7-year span, no big deal. And as the time of Jacob's service started to come to a close, and Leah had not been married, then for him, he's probably thinking, okay, I'm going to have to do something different here. And he goes